What is up guys, Photo Fever here, and in today's lens review we're going to be having a closer look at this, the Canon RF 70-200mm f4L IS lens. And I'm going to start right now. This here is the Canon RF 70-200mm f4L IS lens. Now this is a brand new lens by Canon, designed specifically for their mirrorless cameras, such as the R5 and R6. But how well does it stack up versus its older EF equivalent? Or is it worth maybe buying one of the Sigma on Tamron versions on the market? Let's find out in this review. So the first thing I want to talk about, guys, is the build quality of this lens, and also the design and how does it change from the older EF equivalent. Well, I must say there is a large difference between this and this lens here. Now, I wasn't able to get the f4 version to compare it to, but I was able to get the f2.8. They are roughly the same size and they are specifically designed the same way. Now, the f2.8 F Mark III version of the EF mount is actually an internal zooming lens, which means when you go and zoom it in and zoom it out, it doesn't get any longer or shorter, which means it has better weatherproofing and waterproofing when it comes to when you're wanting to go outside. Because there is no externally zooming feature, water can't get stuck in between. Now this is where the RF lens is slightly different. As you can see, in its most compact state, it's 70mm, it does look like a full-on lens. But if you go ahead and extend it, you can see there is a section that comes out, which is very different to the traditional white series lenses. Only a couple of lenses used to do that. So this is a big change when it comes to any of the RF lens mount systems. Now that doesn't mean that it's totally useless and it's going to get completely ruined in the rain. It does mean you just need to take a little bit more care than the traditional 70-200mm. But it does have waterproofing and a lot of the features that you'd expect of a lens of this price point. So as you can see, it's got the control ring and it's clickable, which is really handy for changing all sorts of features within cameras, something that the EF version was missing. And it has got a whole bunch of buttons on the side here that you can change all of the autofocus features, but also turn off and on the image stabilization, as well as having 3 independent modes. So overall, this lens did score quite high, but it can't score the full 10 out of 10 because I don't think the external zooming feature is going to be great for someone that's used to lugging this around and being able to go in all sorts of environments. It's a little bit more of a delicate lens, I think, with this external zooming feature. Although it is definitely better for size and weight, this is a tiny lens. So overall, I think it scored quite high, but not the full marks. So I'm going to be giving it a 9 out of 10 for build quality and the overall design of the lens. So next I want to be talking about is the image quality of this lens. How well does it perform versus its older EF versions, but also other third-party camera brands such as Tamron and Sigma? Let's find out by looking at a few sample images. Now I headed down to Liverpool to go ahead and take a few sample shots with my brother. And I've got to admit, this is a really interesting lens to use when you're using it for street and kind of urban landscape photography. I wouldn't traditionally use a 70-200mm, so I really had to think about the different types of shots, and I really had to think very far forward when I was looking at composition. Now I actually really like the sharpness and contrast of this lens. I noticed it had great contrast and sharpness in the center, although I did sometimes find the corners were softer than I was hoping for. I also really like the colors of this lens as well. I thought it was a really good performer with the brights and darks that you can find in an urban environment. So overall, I was really impressed with using this lens when I was out in Liverpool. So let's go and have a look a little bit more scientific at some graph images. So let's go and have a look at some of the graph images here to really test this lens's sharpness. So in the center at 70mm at f4, you can see there is a good amount of sharpness and a good amount of contrast. But if we go ahead and zoom into the corners, you can see that it is a little bit darker, but also just a little bit softer. So overall, not great if you're after a very sharp lens at wide open at f4. But that does change if we go ahead and look at f5.6, and it gets noticeably sharper both in the center and in the corners at around f8. So let's go ahead and zoom to 200mm. Now, if we go ahead and zoom into the center, that sharpness stays there, but again, if we look at the corners, they are noticeably softer with a slight reduction in contrast. You'll also notice they're a little bit darker as well, but they do brighten up and become sharper at f5.6, and they are noticeably sharper and noticeably brighter at f8. And lastly, let's go and have a look at distortion and vignetting. Now at 70mm at f4, you'll notice there is a small amount of distortion, but there is a very small amount of vignetting. But if we go ahead and step down to f5.6, you'll notice the corners are a lot brighter and there is no vignetting at f8 whatsoever. But obviously the distortion doesn't change, which is a really good if you're wanting a good lens with very little distortion. But that does change a little bit at 200mm. You'll notice the corners are noticeably darker with a small amount of pincushion distortion. Now we can remove the vignetting. If we step down to f5.6, it pushes it right into the corners, and to completely remove it, all you need to do is step down to f8. But that pincushion stays there unless you go ahead and change your corrections on in camera or in the Camera Raw filter. So overall, I was really impressed by the lens's image quality. This was incredibly sharp, and I would say it's almost as sharp as some of the Sigma and Tamron prime lenses that I've tested. So if you're after a really sharp telephoto zoom lens that doesn't necessarily break the bank, then this Canon RF lens is going to be absolutely perfect. And I would say it is sharper than the EF version of this lens that comes in at slightly cheaper. So overall, this is a good mark for this lens. I'm going to be giving it a 9 out of 10 for image quality. So next, let's talk about the size and weight of this lens. Now, this is by far the smallest and the lightest Canon 70-200 lens on the market, but by how much? Well, this lens comes in at just 695 grams. And as you can see by the size of it, this is minuscule. When we put it in a bag, it roughly takes up the same amount of room as a prime lens. So we can see we've got it compared here to the Canon 85mm f1.4. And if we then go and compare it to the Canon 70-200 f2.8, the EF version, you can see that takes up a lot more room. It also is a lot heavier. This particular lens here, although it is an f2.8, so do take that into consideration, this lens comes in at a whopping 1,440 grams. So it pretty much weighs double the weight. And even if we compare it to the EF f4 version, it is even lighter than that, coming in at 780 grams. And then if we compare it to the RF version, because you can choose either the 2.8 or the f4, this one comes even lighter than that. So this is a really small and lightweight lens, which I really did notice when I was walking around Liverpool. Using this lens, it doesn't feel like you're using it just feels like you're using like a 70-200mm. You're not lugging around a gigantic lens like this. So overall, this scored incredibly high, coming in at a whopping 9 out of 10. So if you're after a small, lightweight telephoto lens, this lens is definitely the one for you. Next, let's talk about the focus motor and image stabilization of this lens. Now, I've got to admit, this is a massive difference over the older EF version. The EF version was great, but this is just so much better when it comes to the image stabilization. Now, Canon have gone a slightly different direction than other camera brands. They have gone for a hybrid image stabilization system. So when you're using the 70-200 with an image stabilized camera, such as the R5 we've got here, but you can use the R6 or the brand new R3, you get up to 8 stops of image stabilization, which is a game changer when you're using low light. And it kind of really makes this lens a little bit different because it's got a limited factor of it's got an f4 aperture. You're gonna have to use the image stabilization to get sharper images, simply because you're gonna introduce motion blur because the narrower aperture of f4. So because of that, you're gonna get sharper images at lower light conditions with lower shutter speeds. So overall, this is a really good lens when it comes to wanting to use it for video, or if you're wanting to use it for still photography in lower lit conditions. So how well does the focus motor work? Well, I tested it in both video and photography, and both of it was blindingly quick and incredibly successful. To be honest, I barely heard it. So when I was even right up to the camera, you could just hear a slight whirring sound. So this is an incredibly quiet lens when you're wanting to use it for video. Now, obviously, it isn't necessarily a great video lens if you're using it for, let's say, inside studios, but if you're using it for weddings and things like that, coupled with the image stabilization, you can get rock solid images and rock solid video without using a gimbal. So this is a great kind of run and gun lens when you're using it maybe more for B-roll. And because you've got the compression of 70 to 200mm, you can get really good background separation even with the f4 aperture. So overall, I thought this lens was absolutely amazing when it came to the image stabilization and the focus motor. So I'm going to be giving it the full marks, the 10 out of 10 for focus motor and the image stabilization of this lens. So last but most importantly is the price. How well is this lens priced versus its older EF versions or its f2.8 brother in the RF system? Well, to be honest, it's not a great start by Canon. Their lenses are incredibly expensive versus the competition. Just to think, this is an f4 lens coming in at a whopping £1,719. Now they're expensive for a few reasons, but most importantly is because they're mostly brand new. You can't get secondhand ones and only Canon make an RF mount so far. We are desperately waiting for Sigma and Tamron to make RF mounts because their lenses are going to be so much cheaper, but to be honest, they're going to be the same image quality. But how does it compare to, let's say, the older EF f4 version? Maybe you can get a mount adapter. Well, that lens comes in at £1,339, although you're going to be able to get a second-hand one because that lens has been out for donkey's years. So how does it compare to the f2.8 version? Maybe it's not too much of a difference. Well, I'm afraid that is not going to be the case. The f2.8 version comes in at a whopping £2,729. Pretty much £1,000 more expensive just for pretty much 2 stops of light brightness. And how does it compare to, for instance, this lens here? So this is the Canon 70-200 f2.8 Mark III, coming in at £2,199. But again, you can probably get this for about £1,000 if you go and have a look at the secondhand market. So overall, this lens is ridiculously overpriced for being an f4 lens, and you're gonna be able to get a lot better value for money if you go and have a look at older EF versions, but you have got to use the mount adapter if you are using it on the R5, R6, or even R3. So overall, this scored quite poorly just simply because the astronomical price that Canon are asking for. So I'm only going to be giving it a 5 out of 10 for price. So what are my final thoughts and should you buy this lens? Well, I'm going to split it into 2 categories. I'm going to split it into the professional side and then I'm going to split it into the amateur side. If you're a professional photographer, that means you're shooting for a living and you're going to be using this lens day in, day out, I'm going to say you probably shouldn't buy it. Now, the reason is it's only an f4 aperture lens. You're going to be able to get an f2.8 either buying the RF version for an extra £1,000 more, or you can go ahead and pretty much get the same for the same price. You can get an EF f2.8, which is a lot brighter when it comes to the amount of light is let reaching through the sensor. So you're not going to have to crank that ISO all the way up. But if you're an amateur photographer, you don't want to spend a lot of money on a lens, but you're after something that's absolutely nail-bitingly sharp, that's pretty much the same image quality of a larger lens, or maybe even if you're a travel photographer and you're after a run and gun lens, it's a little bit smaller, that won't take up so much room in your camera bag. That is when I think you should probably buy it. But again, that f4 aperture really does limit where you can use this lens. I would always refer going back to the f2.8 aperture lens because I absolutely love the amount of light that can hit the sensor. It means it's so much better for low light, and it also creates a shallower depth of field even between the 70 and 200 millimeters. There isn't a large difference, but I always think that the f2.8 just looks a little bit nicer. And as a professional photographer such as myself, I always end up gravitating towards that. So how well did this lens scored overall? Well, coming in at 43 out of 50, this is a highly recommended lens, but do bear in mind that the f2.8 is going to be so much better just because of that aperture. So overall, I'm going to say as an amateur photographer, definitely buy one. But as a professional photographer, maybe hold off and save up a little bit more money to get the 2.8. Thanks guys for getting to the end of this video. If you want to learn more about Photoshop, Lightroom, and everything photography related, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell notification so you guys don't miss any of my latest content. If you want to watch my most recent video, I've got a playlist just up here. Or if you want to watch more about Photoshop tutorial, because I also do those as well, make sure to click the playlist just here. But until next time guys, you know what to do. Keep creating.